Hey, I'm the Theory Creep. Welcome to the Theory Creep, and here we are back in New Jersey City, Newark City, Seattle. The show changes the location of this city a few times. You guessed it, we're still talking about Aqua Teen Hunger Force. This video and probably the next 2 or 3 videos are going to be dealing with one question, and that is, what is Aqua Teen Hunger Force parodying? The subject of the show's parody seems to shift as the show progresses. As I mentioned in the last video, for the first episode and a half, the Aqua Teen Hunger Force is a detective company. They are looking for private investigation jobs. They're trying to be detectives. The show starts as a detective parody. In fact, the first episode follows the format of the detective story almost perfectly. It begins with a murder. Well, actually, it begins with the creation of the murderer by Dr. Weird.
Behold, the Rabbot!
So Dr. Weird makes a rabbit robot and then sprays it in the eyes with hair growth spray, and it escapes from his lab.
It's because that's how it happened to me! Now you feel pretty, don't you? The Rabbot! My creation! What has science done?
Most detective stories start this way. They start with a murder that is not visible to the cast of the show or to the cast of the story, but often it is known to the audience. This gives us the impression that the mystery of the show has a distinct and singular resolution. In fact, we're so sure of this resolution that we're often shown it before the story starts. This often leaves little to no doubt that the detective has caught his man at the end of the story because the audience saw the crime take place. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about the figure of the detective and also the figure of the scientist, because especially in the early days of detective fiction, the two figures were kind of one and the same. They're both Enlightenment heroes. They're both individualists whose individual rational faculties allow them to master the world. They're the wanderer above the sea and fog. Both the scientist and the detective begin their story with a messy, unorganized set of facts or evidence or data, and then using their individual rational faculties, which are the highest values of the Enlightenment, these figures rearrange the chaos of the world around them. They order the facts around them in order to find meaning. Now, as we've talked about in this channel before, this implies a very specific, very Western understanding of truth. That it's something, that it's a destination, that it's something we work towards and arrive at. And then when we're there, it's a singular, understandable, discrete entity, truth, that's separate from the things around it. The detective and the scientist, for example, Sherlock Holmes, are really emblematic of these beliefs. Sherlock Holmes is smarter than everyone around him. He can see things that other people don't. This sets him apart from the anonymous masses, and in fact, the narrator of Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, is a member of the anonymous masses. And it seems like his whole role in the story is to just marvel at Sherlock Holmes's intelligence. It is just like all Watson is there to do is to remind us that Sherlock is different from the rest of us. This should remind us of Faye Alberti and the way that she talks about the Enlightenment and individualistic values as a source of loneliness in our day-to-day lives. If we all want to be like Sherlock, if we all want to be isolated from the masses, different from them, if distinction and originality are values for us, then loneliness is just an essential, natural kind of symptom of those values. I think that values of individualism and uniqueness and distinction aren't useful to us anymore in the digital era, and I think that they are becoming obsolete. The first episode of Aqua Teen really helps represent this growing obsolescence of the figure of the detective. As culture becomes more digital, more virtual, more postmodern, the idea that truth is singular, or the idea that evil or irrationality are distinct and knowable, these ideas are becoming more and more troublesome, less and less applicable to our daily lives. The first episode of Aqua Teen dramatizes the growing obsolescence of the figure of the detective or the scientist in modern culture. As things become more digital, more virtual, more postmodern, truth becomes less and less distinct, less and less knowable, less and less separatable from falseness. We might expect the characters in Aqua Teen to be confronted with this crime, to solve it, to find the murderer of Carl's car, to resolve the chaos of their world. But that's exactly the opposite of what they do.
It is mystery time. We have a case to solve. Aqua Teen Hunger Force, assemble! Now look, it's clear to me that meteors have destroyed Carl's car, but he's committed to give us $20. So what I propose we do is to spend that money now before he has time to take it back.
From the beginning of the first episode, Shake is totally disinterested in solving the crime.
Why are these jeans all covered in hair?
Why is anything anything?
Truth is a burden to the characters in Aqua Teen Hunger Force, especially in the first episode. Frylock is trying in vain to push the cast towards solving the crime, but Meatwad and Shake especially are completely disinterested.
What are you doing? What's taking so long? Why are we still here?
How close are we to avenging the death of Carl's car? And please say soon, because I am bored.
A large quantity of hair growth formula is missing from this counter.
Well, as long as we don't go back to the lab.
I need to go back to the lab.
God, that'll take 1,000 hours.
Think about that for a second. Truth is a burden to these characters. They're detectives. They're solvers of crimes. They're finders of truth. But in this new digital cartoon virtualized world, truth is really inaccessible to them. We would expect the criminal, the Rabbot robot, to be evil, to be violent, to be something that needs to be stopped. But when the characters confront it, it's really unclear whether or not this robot is dangerous. It seems kind of friendly, to be honest.
You tamed him with your greasy dance of joy.
And again, this is a deconstruction of the typical detective story, where the criminal is uncomplicatedly evil. They're a force that obviously needs to be stopped, and the detective, as the person who's going to stop that evil force, is uncomplicatedly good, and his rationality is an essential part of his goodness. But the Aqua Teens are totally irrational and totally not good. Let's think about the Rabbot for just a quick second here. In his early life, he was traumatized by his father figure, Dr. Weird. He was sprayed in the face with a hair growth formula of some kind. Now, in his adult life, his life in the world, he's reenacting that trauma. So the show, even though it's 11 minutes long and Rabbot only gets like 2 minutes of screen time, the show has managed to complicate evil quite effectively. Rabbot runs amok downtown, but it's for good reason. It's because as a child, he was hurt by the ones that he loved. He's reenacting trauma the way that humans do, and frankly, probably the way that a lot of criminals do. This complicates evil. It shows us that evil people, that criminals, that wrongdoers are complicated things, and that they have reasons that were beyond their control for what they do. So as I mentioned, truth is a burden to the Aqua Teen, especially Shake. Shake is completely disinterested and totally troubled and overwhelmed by this expectation that he will find the truth of the situation that they're in. But beyond that, beyond truth being a burden to Shake, Shake is abusing his role as a truth seeker, which should also remind us of modern-day police politics. He knows that Carl, the victim of the crime, is totally unequipped to find out the reality of what happened to his car, and Shake, as the one in power, the one in the position of finding the truth, he's totally prepared to abuse that power. In fact, he just expects that that's what's going to happen. He suggests blaming the death of Carl's car on a meteor strike. Shake is really the anti-detective. And again, this is reminiscent of modern police politics. More and more in the postmodern world, we trust police less and less. You can just look at representations of justice in mass media. I mean, there's Cops, which is, frankly, surprisingly violent considering it's establishment sanctioned. But even Cops doesn't really present us with a version of policing that we're meant to trust. Maybe we're meant to trust it, but it doesn't actually inspire a lot of trust. What you see is a lot of violence being perpetrated for seemingly no reason. Or you can look at more serious and dramatic representations of justice, like The Wire.
Just charge Barksdale with the temp purchase from New York and bring it all home.
And what about Stringer, his number 2? He slipped off the hook when we lost the boy witness.
We've done all we can.
Are you hearing me? These are the people responsible for dropping a police. Not just the shooters, but the ones who make the dirt happen. I'm trying to put them down for real, not for some short-time bit.
This case ends, or you are done. Hell, I don't even need you to lock up Barksdale. I'll have your major debrief your detectives, type the warrants himself. This case is done.
Or The Night of.
But then again, a knife-wielding, heavy-breathing sex brute. It's not a pretty picture.
Sex brute? Okay, you need to understand what happened here, all right? We were at her place, we were drinking, I don't drink, and she started giving me all
I
kinds
want to tell you something, and it's the most important thing you'll ever hear in your entire life, so don't not hear it. Shut it.
You keep saying story like I'm making it up. I want to tell you the truth.
You really don't. I don't want to be stuck with the truth. Not until I have to be.
But you need to know what happened.
I need to be flexible.
These shows are obsessed with the fact that justice is a bureaucratic political process that is not particularly concerned with finding truth and more concerned with preserving the careers of the people who participate in its institutions. Police, lawyers, judges, that kind of thing. Now, I mentioned the scientist along with the detective earlier because Dr. Weird is a reoccurring figure in Aqua Teen Hunger Force. In fact, I think in the lore of the show, he's responsible for creating the Aqua Teens. Like, they also escaped from his lab the way Rabbot did. Now, Dr. Weird is an anti-scientist, the way that Shake is an anti-detective in the first episode. Everything about Dr. Weird runs against the grain of the expectations of the Enlightenment scientist. He's totally irrational. His experiments are not working towards resolving and ordering the world. He's actually introducing more chaos into the world as he does his work. He's a mad scientist. He's an anti-scientist. Aqua Teen Hunger Force is astonishingly obsessed with undermining Enlightenment values, especially in the first episode of the show, but also in general, because after the show does this detective parody for an episode and a half, it shifts almost immediately into a horror parody, into a sci-fi horror parody kind of show. And this mirrors a transition in modern culture from the Enlightenment into the postmodern, kind of chaotic, unknowable world. We, the people of the world, have become horror protagonists as opposed to detectives. We don't order the world anymore. We're not rationalist individuals who are going out into chaos and making it manageable. We're victims of the world. The world is chaotic and unknowable, and it assails us with chaos constantly. And when we look into ourselves, we see the chaos of the world in us. we're less and less agents and more victims, and Aqua Teen's transition from detective agent into horror victim is a reflection of this transition.
I've called this meeting to say that downtown is no longer safe. So in short, we need to pick some new restaurants and nightclubs.
As we've discussed in this video, it starts off with a parody of detective fiction and detective stories, and quickly moves into a parody of horror stories. And this mirrors the transition from Enlightenment to postmodernism in modern culture. So does that mean that Aqua Teen is parodying modern culture? Is Aqua Teen parodying Enlightenment values and then postmodern values? So the detective reaffirms this idea that evil is distinct. It's over there. It's in that dude. He's a bad dude. Good thing we threw him in jail. We don't have to worry about evil anymore. It's not a hallucination. It's not an illusion. Evil is tangible. It's physical. It's knowable. Aqua Teen is laughing at this notion of an understandable kind of evil. It's laughing at the idea of understanding anything at all. I think it's a parody of truth. I think it's a parody of the Enlightenment and of Enlightenment values, and it's also a parody of postmodernism to some extent. But the fact that Aqua Teen takes the horrors of postmodernism and the failures of the Enlightenment and makes them funny is a useful tool, because really all we can do in the face of the confusion of the modern world and the failures of the rational world, all we can do in the face of those failures is laugh, because if we did anything else, it would be potentially quite dangerous. It would be potentially falling into the failures of the past. If we looked at postmodernism and we said, no, this is too confusing, we need to order this and rationalize this, we would be doing exactly what Enlightenment thinkers did in the past, and we'd be making the same mistakes they did. So it's kind of amazing that Aqua Teen Hunger Force, a television show that was only 11 minutes long and really was geared towards like basement-dwelling stoners, it's amazing that this show manages to represent these things and remain funny. So anyway, that concludes our discussion of detectives in Aqua Teen Hunger Force. It's a short one because, as I mentioned, they're really only detectives for an episode and a half. There's the first episode where they're chasing the Rabbot robot, and then for about half of the second episode, they're trying to find Carl, who was kidnapped by some killer trees. And about halfway through that episode, they give up on saving Carl and just run for their lives from the killer trees. It's a really good show. I know it hasn't been on TV for about 5 years, but if you haven't watched it, you should definitely check it out. And if you have watched it and it's kind of, slipped off into your distant memory, it might be a good time to rewatch a little bit of the show. It's still very funny. It's aged very well. Anyway, thanks for sticking around. Thanks for watching. This has been The Theory Creep. I'm The Theory Creep, and we'll see you next time.